Hello Internet, this is BearPunchMagic, and today we are building a commander deck that does not play Soul Ring. The first thing we need to do is to take a look at our commander, Yidris Maelstrom Wanderer. So for a blue, a black, a red, and a green, so 4 mana total, you get a 5/4 legendary creature who doesn't really matter for this deck. This is one of those situations where we're only really using Yidris for his colors. The real leader of this deck is not the commander, but rather its companion, Gyruda, Doom of Depths. Before we talk about Gyruda, I wanted to briefly talk about Companion. So Companion is an ability that, in exchange for some deck building restriction, allows you to add the card from outside the game into your hand. Keep in mind that this is different than what is actually printed on the card. So Gyruda's specific restriction is this. Your starting deck consists only of cards with even mana costs. So while this does prevent us from playing cards like Kodama's Reach or even Soul Ring, there are still plenty of powerful cards in our arsenal. Gyruda costs 4 and 2 blue-black hybrid mana, and says, whenever Gyruda enters the battlefield, each player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard. Put a creature card with an even mana cost from among those cards onto the battlefield under your control. The deck itself has an extremely simple game plan. Step 1, ramp. Step 2, Gyruda. This deck is built to do exactly one thing, and that is get Gyruda out as quickly as possible. Even though Gyruda himself technically costs 6 mana, you also have to factor in the 3 additional mana required to put him into your hand. And because of this, we're going to want to play a much higher quantity of ramp cards than normal. Now because we can only play cards with even mana costs, most of our ramp is going to come in the form of 2-cost artifacts and creatures. We have cards like the Talismans, which can produce a colorless mana, or by paying a life can produce a mana of either of 2 colors. The Signets, which while they can't produce mana on their own, can produce a pair of colors by paying a mana into it. There are also several good 2-mana creatures we can play in this deck, cards like Sylvan Caryatid, Beastcaller Savant, and Paradise Druid. But because most of these cards will have Summoning Sickness, in the early game's artifacts are probably going to be your best bet. We can play some 4-mana cards like Skyshroud, Claim, or Explosive Vegetation. However, by the time we start having the mana to cast these cards, we should also be able to start considering playing Gyruda, which would generally be a better plan. There are a handful of powerful artifacts that we can play that cost 0 mana. Cards like Mana Crypt, Mox Diamond, Chrome Mox, and Lion's Eye Diamond. However, these are all very expensive, but if you do have access to them, playing them would be a good idea. So Gyruda's ability is an enter the battlefield trigger, which means anything that enters the battlefield as a copy of Gyruda will also get to trigger that ability. So because of this, we're going to be playing as many clone and copy effects as we can. That way when Gyruda enters the battlefield, you can mill 4 and get a clone effect that will enter the battlefield as a Gyruda, which lets you mill 4 and get a clone effect, which will enter the battlefield as Gyruda, which will mill 4 and get you another clone effect that will enter the battlefield as a Gyruda, and so on and so forth. All of that said, the first clone effect is, well, clone, which just becomes a copy of Gyruda. Clever Impersonator also becomes a copy of Gyruda, but if necessary, can become a copy of any non-land permanent. This part of it generally isn't going to come up, since the deck is specifically built to copy Gyruda, but depending on the board state, there might be a spicier target. Altered Ego doesn't do anything special, since we generally aren't casting these creatures, but if you do have to cast it, you can sink some mana into it to make a bigger Gyruda. Stunt Double also doesn't add anything unique to Gyruda while he's on the battlefield, but he does have Flash. So because you can cast it at instant speed, you can cast it in response to an opponent's removal spell and sacrifice the original target to the legend rule. Vizier of Many Faces is great in this deck, because not only does it enter the battlefield as a copy of Gyruda, but it has Embalm, which means we effectively get to cast it a second time from the graveyard. Or if we were to mill multiple clone effects with one Gyruda trigger, we can leave the Vizier in the graveyard because we know we'll be able to get him back later. Sakashima the Imposter actually keeps his name when he becomes a copy of Gyruda, so you can keep both of them on the battlefield. He can also bounce himself back to your hand, so you can recast him and start the shenanigans up again. Spark Double is, in my opinion, tied for the best clone effect in the deck. So when Spark Double clones Gyruda, it loses its legendary super type. And this non-legendary version of Gyruda is part of the copyable card trait, so any clones of the Spark Double Gyruda will also be non-legendary. If you can get Spark Double out early, you could potentially make a small army of Gyrudas that can hit for a lot of damage. Progenitor Mimic is the other clone effect that can be considered the best in this deck. It does have the highest mana cost if you have to hardcast it, but if it sticks on the battlefield, you get an extra Gyruda every single one of your turns. Since most of the deck is going to end up in the graveyard, there should be ways to get cards back to your hand or the battlefield. Aid the Fallen, Macabre Waltz, and Treasured Find, among others, can all get Gyruda or the other clone effects back into your hand from the graveyard. There are some cards that can put them directly onto the battlefield. Animate Dead is the classic, doing exactly what the name says and returning the creature to the battlefield. Underworld Breach is just a generally busted card, but we can make use of it in this deck. Since our graveyards will be likely very full, the escape costs won't be particularly difficult to pay for. We can get some extra value out of just having a bunch of cards in our graveyard. Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise, and other cards with Delve, can usually be cast for very cheap later in the game once you have started to mill the table. Cards like Scour All Possibilities and Deep Analysis both can be cast with Flashback, drawing you cards even if you mill them. Two other just value cards that we should look at playing are Panharmonicon and Leyline of the Void. Panharmonicon makes your Gyruda triggers happen an additional time, doubling your chances of continuing your combos. Leyline of the Void is really good in this deck because it has a great interaction with Gyruda. So Leyline of the Void says, if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. And this is just generally going to be very good, being able to exile your opponent's graveyards so they have no way of getting those cards back. Additionally, Gyruda doesn't actually care where the cards it mills go. So with Leyline of the Void out, instead of the cards going to your opponent's graveyards, they go to their exile. But if you don't have something that you can take out of your own graveyard, you can still get the cards that it milled off of its ability, even if they are in exile. The mana base for this deck is generally going to need to be very consistent and very fast, since we are trying to combo as quickly as possible. Obviously, the more powerful lands, like the original dual lands, fetch lands, even some of the Ravnica shock lands, are going to be more on the expensive side, but the more frequently we can have our appropriate colors earlier in the game, the better for us. The fast lands from Kaladesh and from Scars of Mirrodin are really good in this deck, since the first several turns are the most important. Later in the game, when they are likely to come in tapped, we should already be far enough ahead that the potential drawback is negated, or we've been able to ramp so much that we don't really need that land drop. The Horizon lands from Modern Horizon are also really good here. Even though you're always going to have to pay a life to get a mana out of them, if the game goes long, you can turn those lands into extra cards. So because we really are only going to have access to Gyruda the one time, you might find that this deck might be more inconsistent than one that uses Gyruda as the commander rather than the companion. That said, the relatively explosive nature of this deck can more than make up for that. With a little bit of luck, we can get Gyruda out as early as turn 3 or turn 4, while other players are still setting up their boards. Unfortunately, this deck's explosive nature is a double-edged sword. As so much of the deck is devoted to ramping and Gyruda-ing, we don't really have much in the means of protection or removal or any sort of long game. So if you wanted to retune the deck to fare better in those situations, perhaps cutting some of the ramp and maybe a couple of the cloning spells might be the way to go. Also, never forget, even though we haven't really talked about him at all in this video, we do still have access to Yidris, Maelstrom Wielder, our commander. He doesn't really have much synergy with this deck, but he is still a powerful creature in his own right, and can do things. That's all I have to say about Yidris and Gyruda. Thank you for watching.